Spring of 1945 sat like a bruise over the western provinces. Thawing fields, broken roads that held mud, and the echo of a collapsing order. Columns moved not in the disciplined cadence of the early war, but in ragged, unsure flows. Soldiers, refugees, and those whose work had once made them keepers of life, now reduced to dragging themselves across a landscape that no longer promised safety. In the small towns between the front and the rivers, the instruments of care, hospitals, ambulances, supply depots, had become unreliable myths. The question that hovered above many days was simple and terrible. What happens to the healers when the system that sustained them has been dismantled? If this account holds your attention, please stay until the end and consider subscribing for more recovered histories like this one, stories that find the human moments buried in larger events. They had left the city at dusk, 3 nurses and the woman who led them, a mid-30s head nurse whose hands still managed a clipboard in memory, if not on paper. She had been called Frau Heller in the ward and by the doctors, though the name on the papers read a longer form that only intimates would use. For the column she wore what remained of a gray coat, a faded white armband that had once marked neutrality and now marked survival. Her hair was pinned back because that was what nurses did. Pinning made a border against chaos. Behind her stumbled a small group of young women. Anna, barely 20, who smelled of starch and a memory of roasts at home. Lotta, who carried a scarf always wet at the hem from tears she would not let fall wholly, and Elsa, whose feet were already a ledger of marches, wrapped in scavenged cloth. They moved by habit and injunction. Keep moving, avoid main roads if possible, follow tracks that led away from artillery flash. Supply lines had collapsed weeks before. Bandages and morphine were now rationed in memory. Food had been reduced to stale bread and turnips, and the kitchens that once sent out trays of warmed broth were gone or occupied for other purposes. The leader mapped the route in her head by small certainties: where a bridge might still stand, which farmhouses were likely to hide people who could spare a bowl of soup, where the hollow beneath a ruined wall might block the wind. Each decision pressed on her the old ethics of triage: prioritize the many, sustain the fragile, choose where hands are most needed. In that moral geometry, she also carried guilt. The hospitals had tended to soldiers who wore the nation's uniform. She had sewn for them, washed them, kept the records. Now the uniform meant little. The woman who had once been a faithful hospital administrator felt suddenly like a steward of what remained of a profession that would soon be judged not by uniforms, but by who still extended a hand. They had no clear destination. Western forces advanced. Whispers in the road said units of the American armies were pushing beyond the next ridge. Rumors acted like compass points, unreliable yet necessary. The leader's directive was to reach any place where wounded might find aid, where the march could pause long enough to clean, feed, and bandage. It was not an order published anywhere. It was a moral line drawn in the mud. The march became a montage of erosions. Rain began one morning like small accusations, a fine, steady cold that saturated every fold of clothing and sank into the leather of boots. The sound of water in the eaves of ruined barns made a constant whisper. The taste of metal and cold stuck to the tongue. Food supplies shrank to rumors. The young nurses learned to read the faces of peasants, to catch pity and barter for stale rolls or the last egg. Boots, the recurring measure of endurance, thinness, exposed toes, the stitch lines that failed, became a language. The women traded matters of comfort in hushed exchanges: a strip of canvas to pad a heel, a scrap of blanket folded under an ankle. At night they lay in haylofts or under weakened beams, listening to distant rumblings and the closer sound of coughing. Sleep did not erase the day's decisions, it only briefed them for dawn. On a wet afternoon, on the road south of a ruined market town, they met the remnants of other services. A veteran hospital orderly with a wheelbarrow of supplies too small to be called a stash, a local doctor who had been stripped of staff and left to work with what he could find, a midwife who, for reasons not wholly explained, had kept a kettle ready. These encounters were not always reparative. Sometimes they were transactions, sometimes reproaches. The leader absorbed each face and each piece of news, where whole convoys were intercepted, where SS elements still moved in maddened pockets, where artillery now sprayed the fields the column sought to cross. Her decisions tightened into a needle of choices, where each direction might carry them closer to safety or to scattering under sudden fire. At night, in a barn they took by polite force because no one came to claim the hay, the leader counted heads and supplies. Lotta peeled back a sock and revealed the first angry pink of a blister. Elsa's breathing had a new edge of fever. Anna, whose letters from home had dwindled to a single postcard, hummed a tune she could not translate into words. The leader sat with a small notebook she had kept since the first winter. Names, medicines, who had eaten and who had not. The notation was not bureaucratic now, but a litany. Food given, bandage replaced, names of those lost to the roads. She listened, and in listening tried to keep the group's moral center from dissolving into private survival. They took to sleeping near doors and thresholds. Doors had become more than wood and iron. They were promises and tests. The barn door was a motif across their march, a threshold between exposure and shelter, between being seen and hiding. When the column neared a hamlet where a barn might be unguarded, the leader felt the tug of the door. Will it open, and to what? By the end of the second week, their uniforms were a patchwork of previous lives. The white armbands had faded to pale crescents. The once proud symbols of medical neutrality, stained and barely legible. The leader kept her armband not out of symbolism, but because it remained a reason for people to look once and consider them doctors rather than combatants. It had no power on the road, but in the presence of an Allied patrol, an armband might buy a moment of different treatment from a soldier who had not yet learned to see past a uniform. The young nurses' backstories surfaced in fragments. Anna spoke of a brother in a factory town who had written about winter bread and gas lamp shifts. She carried his handwriting in a photograph folded small into her palm. Lot's family had been uprooted in the last campaign. She did not speak of their destination. Elsa had been chosen at 16 to nurse in a children's ward and carried the smell of paste and children's breath in the memory of her fingers. The leader had kept them together because to lose one meant to fragment the whole. An ethic of care extended to people who were not patients yet but might be. Caring was no longer professional duty alone. It was a lifeline. Their small convoy drifted into a landscape where battle had made itself through absence. A school with windows smashed, a church whose tower leaned, a bakery whose ovens had cooled and whose door stood open to an empty room stacked with sacks. In the school they found an improvised bed where a handful of wounded, civilians and soldiers alike, were wrapped in blankets too thin for the cold. The leader pulled aside and organized triage, not by rank but by need. Who could be moved? Who required immediate attention? Who might survive with warmth and broth? The scene was clinical in the old way, but the shortage narrowed options until they were not choices but inevitabilities. The collapse of the medical infrastructure had a bureaucratic face. Lorries that once brought supplies had been redirected or requisitioned. Camp and district medical records, once precise and invasive, lay in the rain-softened folders of abandoned offices, their paper swelling and the ink blurring into unreadable memories. The leader's notebook, by contrast, was a living archive. Names, conditions, small decisions recorded for no one but conscience. She had begun to imagine herself a witness more than an administrator, a role that would outlast the war in ways she could not yet see. As they moved closer to the direction from which American accents had been heard, the tension tightened. Each patrol sighted carried the same suspended choreography. Fear in the nurses was not simply for capture, it was for the consequences of capture. Fear entailed interrogation in unfamiliar tongues, the dismantling of an identity that had been propped up by a hospital hierarchy. There was shame, too, an internal calculus about allegiance and culpability. How to explain what they had done under orders, what they had shared with authority, how much of their work had been complicity or rescue. These questions did not require answers in the present, they required only that their hands continue to move, that they bandage and feed and keep count. The morning the Americans found them, dawn was thin and gray. They had taken shelter in a barn whose roof had been patched at some previous season. Inside, hay smelled of old summers. A militiaman, no longer a daunting presence, had left some boards askew to let in air. The group had just stirred when noises came from the lane. Vehicle engines kept low, alternating with the staccato of boots. The leader went to the doorway and peered out. Sun creased the horizon with a tentative light. Beyond it came the silhouettes of soldiers with helmets and an unfamiliar gait. There is a particular hush that attends first contact in war. Sound narrows to the essentials, and breathing becomes a conspicuous act. Fear in that moment folded into a dozen small, sharp choices. The leader could have ordered them to hide deeper in the hay, to make themselves invisible. Instead, she stepped forward, armband gloved in mud, hands set where they could be seen. Her action was a deliberate decision to present a certain truth. We are medical personnel, not combatants. She was aware of the risk. An armored troop might regard any movement as hostile. But she also knew that denying oneself into darkness required more courage than exposing oneself to a possible mercy. From the road, the American sergeant saw the movement at the barn and signaled. He had been in the war for a year that unspooled into 3, and he had the loose, steady command of someone who had seen many mornings change the world. His medic, a young man whose hands betrayed many hours of keeping men alive with scant tools, readied himself with a kit, not for confrontation, but for assessment. They approached slowly. The sergeant's voice was low and English, an instrument rather than a bell. Translation arrived in the form of a refugee attached to the column, a man who had learned enough of the tongue from years of labor in the West. He stood between the lines, a translator of tired gestures. There was a moment when they simply looked at each other. The leader, who felt the weight of those under her care. The sergeant, who recognized the armband and the posture of someone trained to tend. The medic, whose hands were already arranging in his mind the immediate needs: warmth, hydration, wound dressing. The leader's face was lined by decisions rather than age. In the sergeant's eyes, there was a calculation of resources and a human recognition. The war did not end the obligations of care when the uniforms changed. The interaction that followed was less a theatrical exchange than a pragmatic negotiation. The translator relayed that these were nurses exhausted and low on supplies. The sergeant asked simple questions: how many, what injuries, any weapons? The leader answered plainly: no weapons, several with infected feet, one with fever, one fainting when standing. She did not volunteer later certainties, what hospital they had worked in, what their political associations might have been. She knew better than to give more than necessary. The sergeant's decision was as much moral as strategic. His command had a standing order to secure enemy combatants. But medical neutrality was a different terrain. He directed his men to stand down their rifles to form a corridor. The medic set out his canteen, and someone from the American party produced a thermos of hot broth. Food became the first language of mercy. The scent of hot soup in that dim barn cut through weeks of hunger like a bell. Hands that had once arranged surgical instruments now received tins and ladles with a kind of astonished gratitude. The first moments of triage were small and precise. The medic crouched by Elsa's feet, his gloves already working as both tool and barrier. He lifted a cloth and saw the rawness of long marches, skin broken where leather had rubbed and moisture had settled. He did not speak the technical names. His hands argued for treatment: cleaning, drying, patting, rest. The young nurse who had been fainting was eased onto a pile of clean straw, her face pale but bearing the relief of being seen. The leader watched as a man in a different uniform offered what he had: scraps of chocolate from an American ration, the sweetness a strange sacrament. The motif of food threaded throughout these scenes, from turnips boiled in an old pot to the steaming ladle passed across hands that had known only thin bread. Communication was halting. The translator smoothed stitches of meaning, but much was done by touch and the inventory of basic needs. The Americans had an organized way of moving, checklists built into muscle memory. They identified the febrile patient, set aside those needing immediate warmth, and readied to transport the most serious to a field aid station. It was a methodical choreography that belonged to a system that still functioned despite the war's erosion. For the German nurses, accustomed to a collapsing infrastructure, the sight of a functioning medical team was almost a geometrical shock. Fear did not evaporate. It receded into a wary gratitude. The leader's shoulders eased by a degree that seemed small but felt enormous. She allowed herself a half-smile when the sergeant, after basic questions and a brief nod, handed back her notebook and remarked, in words softened by duty, "You're safe for now." Safety, in that voice, was provisional but real. It implied processes and logistics and a bureaucracy that would not necessarily be kind, but would be orderly. For people who had carried decisions like stones, the weight of an organized response was a relief. In the stall next to the doorway, an American medic produced a bar of soap and hot water, and someone began to clean the worst of the dirt from the nurses' hands and faces. The hot water had a small, astonishing effect. Warmed skin drew out a sound of relief, and the leader felt a fatigue rearrange itself into hope. One of the young nurses sobbed quietly when a soldier handed her a piece of bread. The sound was not loud, but it was the surrender of exhaustion. The sergeant crouched and covered her shoulders with his own poncho, an impromptu comfort that transcended language. The boys and men around him behaved with a careful deference. They had been given permission to be humane. Beyond the immediate care, the Americans began to inventory the group. They recorded names as best they could, assigned temporary statuses, and prepared to move the most severe to a mobile aid station less than a mile away. For the leader, this administrative act felt like a passage, from ad hoc survival to the machinery of a force that could process and perhaps rehabilitate. The barn's threshold thus became more than a doorway. It was a hinge between decay and order. The sergeant explained, through the translator, that the aid station could offer clean bandages, antibiotics, limited but present, and more substantial meals. He also said there would be processing for identity and status. The word processing carried no malice in his mouth. It was a functional term, part of a network that treated people as subjects to be cared for rather than enemies to be punished. The leader accepted the offer with the hesitancy of someone accustomed to bargaining for essentials. She thought about what staying would mean. Questions about hospitals served, lines of responsibility, the small terrors of interrogation, and what leaving the women to walk a road in the rain would mean. The choice narrowed itself: to place trust in a system not fully known, or to continue the dangerous autonomy of the road. The Americans prepared stretchers and rucksacks. The medic strapped a small pack of supplies and, with efficient gestures, checked pulses and set a tentative schedule for the march to the aid station. Outside, the land was greased with rain. The barn door, swung open, framed a wet horizon. The sergeant offered his hand to the leader, an act less dramatic in practice than in symbol. She took it, and in that grip there was the transfer of responsibility that neither side had asked for, but both understood. As they moved out of the barn and into the wet light, the recurring motifs, boots, food, doorways, kept asserting themselves. The leader noticed how the American boots carried the shine of recent serviceability. The medic's canteen, dented but full, produced more hot broth. The door they passed through closed softly behind them. Not a blunt cut, but a quiet shush that left the barn's warmth held in memory. They walked in the measured order the Americans imposed, a pace created to protect those most fragile. The leader's notebook remained clutched against her heart as if it were a confession she had to carry. The encounter at the barn was not theatrical. There were no proclamations, only a set of practical responses that, in themselves, were the moral lesson. When systems still function for one side, they can sometimes be extended with deliberate tenderness to those who had been on the other. The sergeant and his medic were not innocents. They knew the war had made enemies and turned ordinary men into something else. Yet in that moment, they chose a fidelity to the human that outranked the ease of suspicion. Inside the aid station that awaited them, the nurses would find an environment where order created margins for recovery: a cot, a bowl of steaming broth, a program of rest. The leader permitted herself to hope, and hope arranged itself into small plans. She would account for the women, explain the circumstances under which she had served, and watch how a bureaucracy handled the moral ambiguities of survival. There would be interviews, lists, and perhaps the distant thunder of politics that would not be resolved on a country road. But for now, the immediate calculus was simpler and truer. The warmth of broth, the pad under a blister, the ability to sleep without listening for approaching boots. They moved toward the field aid station together, a mixed procession of uniforms and persons, footsteps arranging themselves into a new rhythm. The American medic walked beside Lotta and talked in a clipped, patiented English, explaining what would happen next: cleaning, bandaging, rest. His voice had the practical cadence of someone accustomed to giving instructions that kept people alive. It became a tether for the frightened. Lotta clutched at the medic's sleeve, not in betrayal of country, but in a childlike gesture to be steadied. As they reached a small clearing where the aid station had been set up in a repurposed school gym, lights burned like small promises. Inside, blankets had been organized, and a kettle sang on a stove. The rituals of care, the measuring of temperature, the noting of weight loss in a ledger, were not miraculous, but they were methodical and thus generous in their predictability. The leader watched the young women settle into cots, and she allowed herself the luxury of a thought she had not permitted in weeks: that the world might hold a space for repair. The day would yield more paperwork and interrogations, and the slow, grinding process of post-conflict categorization. But for the nurses in the immediate hours following the barn, the simple human acts, steam on a face, salt on a tongue, a bandage changed properly, were the kinds of mercies that made the difference between continuing and failing. The leader sat upright for a long time and made a list of small items she hoped to secure: a proper roll of gauze, an extra blanket, a promise of transport farther from the front. She wrote these not for any authority, but as a ledger of hope. This was the point at which a larger truth emerged, not as an argument but as observation. The human impulse to care often survives institutional collapse if people with power choose to enact it. The sergeant could have followed another logic. He did not. He turned rule into mercy. In the small geometry of the barn and the aid station, the moral equation favored life. Night came on with less rain, and the aid station hummed with subdued activity. A young American medic sat quietly beside Elsa's cot, holding a small piece of bread and listening to a tale that was more fragment than confession. The leader, awake, closed her notebook and felt the weariness of many decisions settle into a different place. A tiredness nodded with something like gratitude. She had kept her group together. She had allowed the world a chance to respond. Outside, the field lights cut the night into rectangles. The door of the gym, the new threshold, stood open for those who needed it. The motifs that had been woven into the day's movement, boots scuffed, doors opened, breads shared, held together a narrative less about triumph than about persistent decency. In a war defined by enormousness, the smallest gestures held their own gravity. They would later tell different stories about what followed in the weeks and months after that dawn. Formal processing at a larger center, decisions about evacuees and staff, the slow calculus of emigration or return. Some of those who had been nurses would find new roles. Others would carry the war's weight long into peacetime. Eyes that did not forget the smell of wet hay or the texture of the last clean bandage. The leader would later find herself debating questions of culpability and complicity, answering inquiries that sought to assign moral lines where the lived reality had been fill-in-the-blank survival. But memory would keep the barn and the sergeant's bowl of soup as a central image. How, in a small place and at a small time, hands extended and an ordinary set of procedures became an act of rescue. For now, in the quiet after the first care, the most pressing need, warmth, clean bandage, a future small enough to plan, had been met. The leader watched the young nurses sleep, heard the soft murmur of the medic taking notes, and understood the shape of mercy as it had been offered. Practical, organized, human. The war outside still raged in ways that would restructure nations and lives. But within the barn and the aid station, a different ledger was being kept. One that accounted for bread, for bandages, for the dignity of being tended without suspicion. The next day would bring transport, questions, and the long, slow work of reintegrating into a world that had been broken in multiple ways. The leader would write down names and conditions. She would sign for supplies she did not have, and she would learn that bureaucracy and compassion could intersect imperfectly but meaningfully. As they prepared to move on, the leader folded her notebook and tucked it into the inner pocket of her coat. The armband, once a faded crescent, had regained a little of its clarity in the light of the aid station. It was no longer merely fabric, but a kind of passport to a moment of reprieve. Yet the image that remained most stubborn in her memory was not administrative. It was the simple geometry of the barn door as it closed. A narrow line of light, the smell of hot broth, the hand of a man in another uniform offering bread. Those small acts, in their particularity, were how the war could be answered, not by grand gestures, but by the slow, patient labor of tending. Outside, beyond the circle of lights that guarded the aid station, the roads still ran into mud and questions. The leader knew that later there would be paperwork, that politics would catch up with personal acts, and that memory would complicate gratitude. But for that night, the barn's threshold had been crossed, and the human business of care had been turned toward repair. They would walk again. They would carry their notebooks and their scars. Somehow, in the pushing and pulling of history, a handful of men had chosen to turn their military authority into an organizing principle of mercy. For the nurses who had once been part of an apparatus that failed them, that decision, quiet, procedural, human, reversed a small and crucial equation. The leader closed her eyes and let the sound of the kettle and the breathing of the sleeping women fold into something like rest. At dawn the next day, the column would move toward a larger processing center where identities would be recorded and futures tentatively sketched. But the moment at the barn lingered as proof that even amid collapse, decency could be performed with tools both simple and profound: food, clean bandages, an orderly hand, and the willingness to see another person not as enemy, but as subject of care. The leader carried that proof forward like a small talisman, its weight not heavy, but steady. They stepped out together into the gray morning, boots sinking into the thaw, and moved toward the uncertain work of the days to come.